My name is Jake, I am 31, and my wife Emily, who is 30, and I live in Cleveland. We had a fairly strong marriage. About 11 years ago, when I was visiting Emily at her parents' house, her best friend Samantha cornered me and demanded to know why I had not proposed yet. Emily stood by silently, clearly enjoying the scene, so I understood her message. She wanted to get married, and I wanted to make her happy, so I started planning our wedding. 2 years later, we were married, and have since had 2 daughters. Our wedding day was one of the best days of my life, and I always aimed to be a good husband and father. Emily wanted a big wedding, and lots of guests attended. We even flew in some family from the Dominican Republic. We were not rich, but we managed well, and our daughters have always been well cared for. Emily is a good mom, but she has a mean streak. She's quick to make snarky comments and often dismisses me, making it hard to have serious conversations. Her wit and fiery attitude initially attracted me, but her dismissiveness is frustrating. Our daughters, ages 7 and 4, adore her, though the eldest has started to mimic some of her behavior. I work in construction management, while Emily runs a nail salon. She has always had an eye for style and insists on keeping up with the latest trends. Despite this, she has cut back on personal spending after becoming a mom, prioritizing our daughters over her fashion habits. Although it can be a bit annoying at times, I am mostly okay with it since our girls are worth the sacrifice. We had a good thing going until I noticed some problems after we bumped into Tony, the ex-boyfriend of Emily's old friend Holly, at the supermarket. He was friendly, and at first I did not think much of it. But when Emily began laughing with him like they were old friends, her smile was a bit too wide and her laughs too frequent. It felt like I had just stepped into a conversation that had been happening behind my back. After that encounter, Emily and Tony started keeping in touch. She claimed they were just catching up, but their conversations became more frequent and noticeably longer. They would talk on the phone late into the night, and their exchanges on social media were overly enthusiastic. Whenever I mentioned Tony or hinted at the late-night calls, Emily would dismiss my concerns, rolling her eyes and laughing it off, telling me I was just being paranoid. Things took a sharper turn on Super Bowl Sunday. That afternoon, Emily was talking to Tony on the phone when I asked her a question about the game. She answered me quickly and then walked over, saying that Tony wanted to talk to me. Caught off guard, I took the phone and said, "Hey, what is up?" He asked if I was planning to watch the Super Bowl, and when I said I was rooting for the Lions, he laughed and said he was too. He then suggested we all watch the game together at his buddy's party. Emily seemed enthusiastic about the idea, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed, not wanting to appear insecure. We dropped the kids off at Emily's brother's place and headed to the party. It was packed with die-hard football fans, and we arrived just in time for the halftime show. The host was rooting for the Bengals and spent the evening ranting about how they were going to win. When they lost, his disappointed reaction gave everyone a good laugh. Meanwhile, Emily and Tony were getting chummy again. They were standing close, laughing and trading stories, with Emily's hand occasionally touching his arm. I tried to join their conversation, but I could not shake the feeling of being left out. At one point, I asked Tony why he and Holly broke up, and he shrugged, saying it was not serious between them. Emily laughed and added that she was surprised because Holly had really liked him. After a while, I grabbed another beer and wandered onto the porch, chatting with a few people out there. When I came back inside, Emily was deep in conversation with Tony in the corner. They were standing too close for my comfort, so I decided to observe from a distance. He was leaning in, speaking softly to her, while she giggled like a schoolgirl. My stomach twisted as I noticed the way she looked at him. I finally signaled to Emily that it was time to head home, but she seemed reluctant, wanting to stay longer. I reminded her that her brother was still waiting on us, so we said our goodbyes to Tony and left. On the drive home, I told her that Tony seemed to be flirting with her, and she just scoffed, saying I was making something out of nothing. But I knew better, and from that point on, I could not ignore the strange dynamic between them. It was as if Emily was enjoying his attention a bit too much. My gut told me something was going on, but every time I brought it up, she would get defensive and tell me to drop it. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy after the Super Bowl party, but my suspicion only intensified as Emily and Tony's late-night conversations continued. The nights she would step out to take calls or keep her phone hidden after hanging up made my stomach churn. I could not shake the feeling that something was off. A few days later, Emily mentioned she was going over to Samantha's place to do her nails. This was not out of the ordinary, so I did not think much of it initially. But later that night, our youngest daughter started asking for pizza. Since I was in the mood too, I decided to call Emily and tell her not to worry about cooking. When I dialed her number, it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, with the same result. I waited about half an hour before calling Samantha directly. She picked up quickly, and when I asked if Emily was still with her, she hesitated before saying, "Oh no, she left hours ago." She explained that Emily had received a phone call that seemed urgent and left abruptly, promising to return the next day to do Samantha's mom's nails. Samantha was annoyed that Emily had not stayed as planned, which only heightened my concerns. I called around to a few other friends and family members, but no one had heard from Emily that day. This left Tony as the only person who could have drawn her away. I was furious and knew I needed to act quickly. After putting the kids to bed, I called my buddy Dave, who lived nearby. I explained the situation and asked if he could come over to watch the kids for a couple of hours while I sorted things out. Dave could hear the frustration in my voice and agreed to help. He showed up within 15 minutes, and I grabbed my car keys, determined to find Emily. Tony had mentioned the general area he lived in during the Super Bowl party, so I headed in that direction, hoping to spot Emily's silver sedan parked nearby. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, scanning both sides of the street. It was a rough area, but at that point, I did not care. Finally, I spotted her car parked in front of a rundown apartment complex. My heart sank as I pulled over to the side and watched for any sign of Emily. A few minutes later, she emerged, wearing a pink tracksuit and looking disheveled. Tony followed her, casually dressed in a tank top and shorts. He was grinning ear to ear, standing much too close to Emily, who did not seem to mind at all. As I watched them chat and laugh before she got into her car, my blood boiled. They were entirely too comfortable with each other, and my worst fears felt like they were being confirmed. I knew there was no way her phone had conveniently died during her visit. All I could do was hope I would beat her back home. I managed to get home before Emily, my mind racing with anger. Dave was in the living room keeping an eye on the kids as they played. I thanked him and quickly sent him on his way, promising to explain later. My stomach churned as I tried to decide what I would say when Emily finally walked through the door. Almost 40 minutes later, she finally arrived, walking in without saying a word. Her expression was guarded as she strolled straight past me and headed to the bedroom. I followed her in and immediately asked, "Why was your phone turned off?" She glanced back at me with a tired sigh. "My phone died, and I had to charge it," she muttered. "What is the big deal?" "Where have you been?" I pressed. "I told you I was at Samantha's," she replied with an edge to her voice. "That is not what Samantha said. She told me you left hours ago. So, where were you?" Emily paused for a moment, her irritation palpable. "I swung by to see Tony for a little while. He wanted to catch up." "Catch up?" I scoffed. "You were at his apartment for nearly 2 hours. Why did you not just tell me the truth?" She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Because you always overreact. Every time I mention his name, you start acting like a jealous teenager. Do you really expect me to believe you were not doing anything wrong?" "God, Jake," she groaned. "You are being ridiculous. There's nothing going on between us. He's just a friend." "Then why does he keep calling you late at night? And why do you have to go over to his place when you are supposed to be at Samantha's?" Emily let out an exasperated sigh and looked away. "I do not have time for this," she snapped. "I am exhausted, and I do not want to argue." She brushed past me and headed to the living room, where she slumped onto the couch and started scrolling through her phone. I watched her for a moment, disbelief tightening in my chest. This was not the Emily I had known all these years. A few minutes later, I saw Emily behind Tony, laughing as she wrapped her arms around his waist and whispered something in his ear. He turned around, grinning, and kissed her on the forehead. They stayed like that for a moment before heading back inside, arm in arm. That was all the confirmation I needed. My suspicion turned into a sickening certainty, and I could barely keep my composure as I drove back home. The next morning, when Emily finally came home, she had a smug look on her face, like she had gotten away with something. She did not even acknowledge me, just went straight to the bathroom to get ready for work. I knew I had to confront her, but I needed to be smart about it. I called Dave and told him what I had seen. He urged me to stay calm and plan my next steps carefully. You have your proof now, he said. It is time to protect yourself and the kids. Talk to a lawyer and document everything. After talking to Dave, I called a divorce attorney and set up an appointment for the next day. I could not go into this without understanding my rights and how to protect my daughters. That evening, I told Emily I had a long day at work and would go to bed early. I needed time to collect my thoughts and prepare for my meeting with the lawyer. The attorney was straightforward and gave me a clear rundown of what I needed to do. He advised me to gather as much evidence as possible before filing and to consider moving some finances to a separate account. It was a lot to take in, but I knew I had to stay focused. When I got home, I found Emily on the couch, completely absorbed in her phone. She did not even look up when I walked in. I went to the kitchen, trying to figure out my next move. I could not let this drag on, but I needed to confirm one last thing before taking action. That weekend, Emily said she was going to Samantha's again, and my suspicions flared up. This time I followed her but kept my distance. She drove to Tony's neighborhood, and after a quick stop at a convenience store for snacks, went right back to his apartment. Her silver sedan was parked in the same spot as before. She did not come out for nearly 3 hours. By the time she got home, it was almost 11 p.m., and she walked in like nothing was wrong. I could barely contain my anger as she cheerfully asked if the kids had eaten dinner. Yeah, I replied coldly. They have. She noticed the tone in my voice and tilted her head. Is something wrong? Yeah, Emily. Something is very wrong, I said, crossing my arms. Where were you tonight? Her face hardened, and she sighed dramatically. I told you, I was at Samantha's. No, you were not, I shot back. You were at Tony's apartment, and I know you have been there several times before. The room fell silent. She stood there stunned, searching for words. How did you know? She finally asked. I have been following you, I said firmly. I have seen you together. How long has this been going on? Emily stayed silent, but her eyes said it all. I knew she was not going to admit it without a fight. You cannot sneak around behind my back and lie to me, I continued. I know you are not just friends with Tony. She took a deep breath, her lips pursed, and said, Fine, Jake. If you really want to know, then yes, I have been seeing him. But you know what? I am tired of you acting like my jailer. What are you talking about? I asked incredulously. You never give me any space, she snapped. You are always checking in on me, always suspicious of everything I do. I needed a break, and Tony was there. That is your excuse? I retorted. You think that justifies what you have done? Emily did not respond. Instead, she turned around and walked away, leaving me standing there, seething. I knew what needed to happen next, and my resolve strengthened as I headed to the bedroom and started making a list of things to do. The first step was ensuring my kids would be okay through all of this. I would not let her betrayal ruin their lives. After that heated argument, I could not stand being in the same room as Emily. I stayed up most of the night on the couch, stewing over our argument and dreading the inevitable fallout. My daughters were blissfully unaware of the turmoil, which only made my resolve stronger to protect them. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at their grandmother's house so they could spend the day there while I figured out my next steps. I called Dave and explained what had happened the previous night. He was not surprised by Emily's reaction, but assured me I was doing the right thing. You need to focus on yourself and the girls now, Dave reminded me. Start gathering all your paperwork and make sure you have everything ready for the lawyer. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I collected bank statements, our marriage certificate, and any relevant documents that could help my case. I also made sure I had screenshots of Emily's messages with Tony and the photos I had taken of them together outside his apartment. Going through it all felt like a gut punch, but I knew I had to be thorough. Later that evening, Emily came home, visibly tense and avoiding eye contact. She did not say much as she settled on the couch, occasionally glancing up at me. Finally, I could not stand the silence any longer. Have you thought about what you want to do? I asked quietly. She hesitated before sighing and rubbing her temples. I do not know, Jake. Everything is just so messed up right now. Are you still seeing Tony? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from her. She looked down and slowly nodded. Yes. Then I think we both know what needs to happen next. Emily frowned, but kept her gaze on the floor. What do you mean? We need to separate. I cannot keep living like this, and the girls do not deserve this instability. Her eyes filled with tears as she wiped them away, but she did not try to deny it. "I am sorry, Jake," she whispered. "I did not mean for things to get this far." "It is too late for apologies," I said firmly. "We will figure out a way to co-parent the kids, but I am filing for divorce." Emily looked devastated but did not argue. She simply nodded and murmured, "Okay." That night, she slept in the guest room, and I stayed up late drafting a detailed email to my lawyer, outlining what had happened and asking for advice on how best to proceed. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at school and headed straight to the attorney's office to finalize my intentions. There was no turning back now. I had made up my mind to leave this behind and start fresh for my own sake and for my daughters. With a heavy heart, I met with the attorney again to discuss the next steps. He reviewed the documents I had brought and the evidence I had collected against Emily. He emphasized how important it was to remain calm and handle things professionally, especially for the sake of our daughters. "We need to figure out a custody arrangement that works best for the children," he said thoughtfully, "and ensure their transition is as smooth as possible." That evening, when I returned home, Emily had already packed a bag and was waiting in the living room. She sat on the couch, staring into space, looking like she had not slept at all. "Jake," she said softly, "I will be staying at Samantha's for a while. I think it is best if I am not here right now." "I agree," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need some space." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our shattered marriage looming between us. Finally, she asked, "What about the girls? They will want to know why I am not here." "I will explain to them that you are taking some time away," I said firmly, "but you should be the one to tell them yourself." She nodded, and after taking a deep breath, she called the girls into the living room. They were confused at first, but as Emily explained that she needed to leave for a while, their little faces crumpled. She promised to see them soon and hugged them tightly. I stood back and let her have that moment, knowing it would be hard for them to understand what was going on. After saying her goodbyes, Emily gave me one last look before walking out the door and into the night. The girls clung to me, sobbing softly, and I did my best to comfort them, even as my own emotions threatened to overwhelm me. The next few days were tough. The house felt emptier without Emily around, and the girls kept asking when she would be back. I tried to keep their routine as normal as possible, but the strain showed, especially in my oldest daughter, who had started withdrawing into herself. Emily would call occasionally, asking to speak with the kids, and I would hand the phone over while keeping the conversation brief. She did not come by often, but when she did, she and the girls would spend time together at the park or at her friend's place. Meanwhile, I worked with the attorney to finalize the divorce papers and arrange a custody plan. It was draining emotionally and financially, but I could not let the turmoil stop me. I had to be strong for my daughters. One afternoon, about a week later, Emily dropped by to pick up some more of her things. She looked worn down, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. "Jake," she said softly, "can we talk?" "What is there left to talk about?" I replied, my voice tired. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, tears brimming in her eyes, "for everything." I crossed my arms, keeping my face emotionless. "Apologies can't undo what's been done, Emily." "I understand," she whispered. "But I want to make things right with the girls. They deserve better." "We both do," I said firmly. "Let's stay civil for their sake, and maybe one day we can discuss forgiveness." She nodded, gathered the last of her things, and left quietly. I watched her drive away, feeling the weight of finality settle deep within me. In the following weeks, Emily and I adjusted to our new routine, living separate lives while staying civil for our daughter's sake. The divorce process progressed steadily, and we settled on a custody arrangement. Emily would have the girls every other weekend and one evening per week. It wasn't perfect, but it provided the stability they needed, which was my top priority. During this time, I began rebuilding my life. I found comfort in spending quality time with the kids and leaned heavily on my close friends and family. Dave became my confidant, helping me see the light on days when the darkness seemed overwhelming. One Saturday morning, I sat down with my daughters for breakfast and gently asked them how they were feeling about everything. My oldest, Emma, looked down at her cereal and finally spoke up. "Dad, I miss Mom, but it's different now." I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes. My heart broke, but I knew I had to be honest with her. I know, sweetheart, things are different, but I want you to know that no matter what, your mom and I both love you and your sister very much. Why did she leave? My youngest Lucy asked innocently. I took a deep breath. Your mom had some things she needed to figure out, and we decided it was best to live in separate places. But will she come back? She'll still see you both often, I assured them, and she'll always be your mom. After breakfast, we went out for a day at the park, and the girls seemed to relax as they played. Seeing them smile gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I knew the road ahead would be tough, but we would navigate it together. Meanwhile, Emily's calls became less frequent. She saw the girls as planned, but was noticeably distant, which the kids picked up on. It was clear that her new life with Tony was keeping her occupied, and I realized that our lives were slowly diverging. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and as I signed the last of the paperwork, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't just the end of my marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter. In the months that followed, I focused on my daughters, my work, and my own personal growth. I started attending a support group for single parents and connected with others who had gone through similar situations. Their encouragement helped me see that I wasn't alone and that brighter days were ahead. As for Emily, she and Tony eventually broke up, and she tried to reach out to me to apologize again. But by then, I had moved on emotionally. I kept our conversations strictly about the kids and ensured we maintained a civil relationship for their sake. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy, but I'm grateful for the people who helped me through it. My daughters are doing well, and they've grown stronger because of everything we went through. I've learned that sometimes you have to let go of the past to fully embrace the future. Life might not have turned out the way I expected, but we're doing just fine.